Things take an absolutely insane turn in chapter 230 of JJK, and all the crazy stuff that happens at the end of this chapter officially moves us into the next phase of Gojo versus Sukuna. All I'm going to say is that the way this chapter ended, it does not seem like this fight is ending anytime soon, but let's get right into it. The chapter starts out with our main cast watching Mahoraga be summoned on the various crow screens that have been broadcasting the entire fight. Mei Mei's the one that actually explains the existence of Mahoraga to everybody else, and this isn't something that I thought about too much prior to this chapter, but almost no one has ever seen Mahoraga, so seeing him for the first time definitely would take some kind of explaining, and thankfully Mei Mei's the one to kind of get that out of the way for us. Well, Yuji wonders if it adapted to Infinite Void, since you know Mahoraga's big thing is being able to adapt to any phenomena that it gets hit with, and we actually get a, semi-clear answer for this in the next page. We then cut back to the standoff between Gojo, Sukuna, and Mahoraga, and I remember in the previous chapter I was a little confused as to how Sukuna was able to summon Mahoraga after getting hit with Infinite Void. Like, how was he able to break out of it and then summon him? And we get a pretty detailed explanation to this right here. To be honest, it's a little complicated, but the summary of it is that Gojo deduces that Sukuna actually made it to where Megumi's soul was the one to tank the hit of Unlimited Void. So in the moment that the sure hit was about to take effect, Sukuna swapped with Megumi's soul and had the wheel above him to adapt to the Infinite Void instead of doing it himself directly. And this just explains so freaking much because, what was it, like a chapter or 2 chapters ago that we first saw Mahoraga's wheel turn a click? Many people theorized that it was kind of being cloaked by the shadows of the 10 Shadows technique, and it turns out that yeah, that was true, but more importantly than that, it was specifically hovering over Megumi. And that's the reason that Sukuna wasn't using the 10 Shadows or any other type of curse technique while he was fighting Gojo that entire time. And that also answers the question that Gojo asked of why Sukuna hasn't been using the 10 Shadows or anything else up until that point, even though he was taking a heavy loss during the fight. Pretty freaking crazy. I hope that Megumi's soul doesn't take any permanent damage from this, because I do expect him to come back at some point. But man, that's just a very, very clever thing for Sukuna to do, and in turn very clever writing by Gege, so definitely enjoyed that part. Well, after realizing all of this, Gojo mocks Sukuna for taking more desperate measures, kind of implying that he's on the ropes, so he has to do all these dirty things to kind of get ahead. And Gojo points out something really interesting that I'm gonna try to explain the best I can, but maybe somebody a lot smarter than me can explain it even better in the comments below. So yeah, if you have a different interpretation of this sequence that might make more sense, then feel free to drop it in the comments below. But Gojo says that when Sukuna swapped with Megumi's soul as soon as Infinite Void hit, it pretty much allowed him to avoid the process of getting hit with Infinite Void, meaning being like completely motionless and getting that massive info dump and not being able to say or do anything. But that doesn't mean that he adapted to the result, which is actually getting hit with the info dump of Infinite Void. And this is a pretty important distinction for what's going to happen in a second. Well, Gojo also deduces that Sukuna's roundabout way of using Megumi to get out of Infinite Void the first time wasn't actually him adapting to it. So if he uses Infinite Void again, he has no choice but to summon Mahoraga, and if that's the case, then Gojo will be ready that time to take Mahoraga out in a single hit. Gojo gets ready to use his domain expansion for the 6th freaking time, but Sukuna doesn't seem phased at all. He even says you can't expand your domain anymore, and we find out on the next page because Gojo's nose starts to bleed profusely, and Yuta realizes that the hunch that he had before turned out to be correct, which is that Gojo's been overusing reverse curse technique to heal his curse technique, which started to heavily damage his brain. Essentially what Gojo had been doing to that point, it turns out that Gojo was destroying and repairing his brain over and over and over again in order to reset his curse technique, and doing that so many times ended up doing permanent damage to him. And you gotta remember that Sukuna was doing the same thing once he saw Gojo do it once, but the difference is that Gojo did it like 5 times already, and Sukuna's done it maybe 3 times, so his brain hasn't been taking as much damage as Gojo has, giving him the upper hand here. It's clear that the damage to Gojo is super heavy because he even falls to his knees, and he straight up looks down for the count. Sukuna gets ready to use his domain expansion once again, and he says, next I'll close my domain with a barrier. There is no escape. All I have to do is cut you and adapt to Limitless. And it's true, Gojo's done. He can't use his domain expansion anymore, and he can hardly move at this point. So Sukuna starts to mock him before he opens up his domain and says, see ya, strongest. A guy that was just born when I didn't exist. An ordinary guy. And of course this is Gege fueling the flames of Gojo versus Sukuna fans. And I don't know, I haven't picked a side in this fight. I've just enjoyed watching it in general, especially with like all the fraud Kuna memes and stuff like malfunctioning shrine, all that. You guys are funny, but moving on. But as Sukuna uses his domain expansion, literally out of nowhere, it completely shatters as soon as it's used. Everyone, including myself when I read it, was completely shocked. And it turns out that Sukuna endured Infinite Void for less than 10 seconds, but like Satoru Gojo, his brain was damaged to the point that he couldn't expand his domain, and he starts bleeding profusely from his eyes and his nose. Like, it looks like he took even more serious damage than Gojo did. So even though Sukuna used RCT to repair his curse technique less times than Gojo did, the effect of Infinite Void on his brain was heavy enough that combining that with the RCT usage to repair his own curse technique, he suffered seemingly even more damage than Gojo did and also can't use his domain expansion anymore. So also this goes back to what Gojo was saying about Sukuna not adapting to the result of Infinite Void, because even though Megumi's soul was the one to take the sure hit, Sukuna didn't adapt to the result of Infinite Void, which was the thing that actually damaged his brain with all the massive dump of information that the ability has. And of course, Gojo, being the arrogant guy that he is, he starts mocking Sukuna because he notices as well that the Infinite Void actually did have an effect on him. He points to some of the crows that are watching the fight and broadcasting it to everybody and says that my students are watching, and goes on to say, I'm still gonna look cool, kind of calling back to the first episode of the anime when Gojo first fought Sukuna and Megumi was watching, so he said that he had to show off a bit for him. Then immediately after this, Gojo pulls in Sukuna and nails him right in the freaking face with a massive punch. And what's interesting is, as this is happening, the narrator reiterates the words that Yorozu told Sukuna when they fought, when she said, I have more to teach you about love and the ultimate strength and solitude it brings. So what I'm assuming is that this is alluding to the fact that Sukuna has finally met his match. He finally met somebody that's strong enough to kind of stand up with him and go blow for blow like they are right now. Because you know that old saying, it's lonely at the top, right? And Sukuna's been at the top for so long that now meeting his match, he's found a certain love for Gojo. Now I'm sure this isn't in an affectionate way, it's more so like a love out of respect for another strong person. But regardless, the fact that Yorozu's quote is being brought up here at the end of the chapter makes me think that in the next chapter, Sukuna might pull out the gift that Yorozu made him at the end of their fight. Because you gotta remember that Yorozu's last thing that she did just before she died was make something for Sukuna that we still haven't seen yet. And I'm sure since Gege put an emphasis on it, it's gonna be something that's gonna make a very, very big change in this fight, or at least benefit Sukuna in some way. I'm not sure what it's gonna be. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think it's going to be, what the gift that Yorozu gave Sukuna is. Also, the editor's comment for this one is, neither stepping back, the battle of the strongest continues to round 2. So everything we just saw, all the domain clashes and everything, was only round 1. So we're probably not going to be seeing any more domain clashes after this, but who knows? We have no break next week, so make sure to subscribe. We have no break next week this time, so make sure to subscribe and turn those notifications on, because I'll be covering JJK chapters as soon as they drop each and every week. I'm also one of the first people to cover JJK leaks, so that's good for you people that can't even wait for the chapter to drop. You can know what happens in the next chapter before anybody else right away. Have an absolutely wonderful morning, night, afternoon, whatever, and I'll see you guys in the next video.